In an earlier episode, we discussed topical preaching, and we answered the question, can topical preaching be biblical? And we suggested that if the preacher goes through the proper exegetical steps over each passage, a topical sermon can in fact be a biblical sermon. Now for this episode, I kind of want to follow up that conversation about topical preaching by suggesting that there are two basic ways that you could outline a topical sermon. They're what Don Sanukian calls parallel assertion topical sermons and progressive assertion topical sermons. Let me explain what each of those mean. Let's start with a parallel assertion topical sermon. A parallel assertion topical sermon starts with a question that your sermon is trying to answer. So for instance, you might try to answer the question, why does God love us? And so you're going to go to multiple texts that are going to give you answers to that one question of why God loves us. And so you might start by going to a text that describes God's love like the love of a father. And you might conclude that God loves us because God is like a father. Then you might go to another text, maybe Jesus in the Gospels or one of the prophets, that describes God like a mother hen who is protecting her chicks. And so you might say that God loves us because God is like a mother. And then you might go to a text like 1 John 4 that simply says God is love. And you might conclude that God loves us because love is just in his DNA. It's who he is. And so you've looked at three different texts that each answer that one question. Why does God love us? That's an example of an outline of a parallel assertion topical sermon. Now let's talk briefly about a progressive assertion topical sermon. This is a sermon outline that starts with a theme and is going to address several layers or several questions surrounding that particular theme. So if we start with that same topic, God's love, we might start by asking the question, why does God love us? And we might answer that question by saying that God loves us because he created us. And we have a text to support that idea. We might say something like, now that we know why God loves us, we want to ask the question, how does God love us? How does God demonstrate his great love for us? And so maybe you turn to the book of Romans, where Paul says that God demonstrated his own love for us in this, that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. And so we learn that God loves us by sacrificing the one thing he loves most in this world, his very son. Then you might ask the question, where does God love us? And you would see that God loves us everywhere. God loves us even when we're on the run. And so maybe you use the story of the prodigal son. And maybe you talk about the book of Hosea as an example. And you might conclude by asking the question, when does God love us? And you point to a text that describes God loving us before the foundation of the world. He's always loved us and will always love us. To the moon and back. To infinity and beyond. And so that would be an example of a progressive assertion topical sermon, where each text is answering a different question. In future episodes, we want to talk about three types of topical sermons. The first is what's called a biographical topical sermon. The second is what's called a theological or doctrinal issue sermon. And the third is what's called a contemporary issue topical sermon. Join us in future episodes.